Dallas, November 1986, 2:14 in the morning. Rachel Chen had just finished a 17-hour shift at Parkland Memorial Hospital. She'd been on her feet the entire time. ER nursing in the worst neighborhood in Dallas, the kind of shift where you see things that don't leave you. Trauma cases, drug overdoses, a 7-year-old who'd been hit by his own mother's boyfriend. Rachel had closed her eyes for approximately 4 hours over the past 5 days, and her car, a 1982 Nissan with a tape deck and worn brakes, was parked 3 blocks away in a lot that stopped being safe somewhere around midnight. She knew this. She knew the route. She knew which streets to take. What she didn't know was that 2 men had been watching her leave the hospital. Not randomly, not by accident. They'd been studying her for 3 weeks. They knew her schedule, they knew where she lived, they knew the route she always took. They knew she carried approximately $140 in cash from her shift, plus a hospital ID badge, plus keys to the narcotics locker, which, to certain people, was worth far more than money. The first man was Marcus Webb, 28 years old, 5'11", 210 pounds. He'd been in the narcotics trade in Dallas since he was 16, 10 years of it. He'd never been caught. He'd never been arrested. He'd worked his way up from corner dealer to supply coordinator for a network that moved heroin and cocaine through North Dallas. He had 31 confirmed arrests in other cities before Dallas, but Dallas PD had never touched him. He was careful, methodical. Marcus had a record that nobody in law enforcement wanted to think too hard about. 7 assault convictions, 2 felony robberies, 1 aggravated kidnapping that had been plea bargained down to a misdemeanor. He'd spent 4 years in state prison. He'd gotten out 2 years ago and walked straight into this supply operation. No parole officer. No check-ins, no oversight, just pure supply, pure demand, and pure opportunity. The second man was David Kemp, 24, 5'9", 195 pounds. Muscle, prison muscle. He'd done 5 years for armed robbery, walked into a convenience store with a .38 and took it all. He and Marcus had met in Huntsville State Prison in 1984. They'd been cellmates for 14 months. David had gotten out first. He told Marcus when Marcus got released that there was money in pharmacy robbery, hospital pharmacy robbery specifically. David was the younger man, but he was the one with the blade, a 7-inch folding knife with a serrated edge. And he'd practiced with it enough that he could open it one-handed, in the dark, without looking. He'd stabbed 2 men since he'd gotten out. Neither had died. Both had bled enough that he never had to use the knife a second time. They'd planned this for 2 weeks. They knew Rachel's routine. They knew the exact moment she'd leave the ER, around 2 a.m. Never earlier, sometimes later. They knew she always walked alone. They knew she always took Maple Street down to 5th, then cut through the residential area toward her apartment. There was a section, right around the intersection of 5th and Gentry, where the streetlights didn't work. Someone had shot them out, or they'd burned out years ago, and nobody had fixed them. That section was exactly 23 seconds long if you walked fast. It was 45 seconds if you stumbled. Marcus and David were parked there in a rust-colored Chevy van with no rear windows. They'd run through this in their heads 100 times. They knew exactly what would happen. Marcus would move first, the knife would come out second, Rachel would scream, nobody would come. They'd take what they needed from her, her money, her badge, her access codes that she'd written down and kept in her wallet like an idiot, and then they'd decide whether or not to take her back to the van. They hadn't actually decided on that part yet. That was the only variable they hadn't settled. But they had 17 minutes before Rachel reached that intersection. 17 minutes to sit in the van and wait. Was that Chuck Norris had been following them. Not stalking, not obsessing, following. With the kind of precision that comes from spending 20 years in combat, 20 years in law enforcement, and 5 years developing an instinct for predatory behavior. Chuck had been in Dallas that week doing a karate seminar. He'd eaten dinner at a restaurant 2 blocks from Parkland Hospital at 1:47 a.m., a late dinner after a long day of training. He was sitting in his car outside the restaurant, finishing a coffee, when he saw the rust-colored van pull into an adjacent lot. He noticed it because of the way it moved. Not because it was unusual, Dallas had thousands of vans, but because of how it was being positioned. The driver wasn't parking it randomly, he was positioning it with a clear sightline to the hospital's ER exit. The engine was running. Two men were inside. They both had that particular kind of stillness that predatory people have. That waiting stillness. That hunting stillness. Chuck didn't have to think about it. He knew. He'd spent enough time around violence, in karate tournaments, in law enforcement, in the military, that he could read it the way other people read words on a page. This was pre-assault positioning. This was a robbery, or worse. Chuck waited until the van had been positioned for exactly 2 minutes. Then, he started his car and pulled in behind it. Not close enough to be obvious, just close enough to see. The two men in the van didn't even look at him. Chuck recognized Marcus Webb immediately, not from a photograph, from 3 different incidents he'd worked on with Dallas PD over the past year. Crimes where Marcus's name had come up, incidents where Marcus had been present. Chuck had never met him face to face, but he knew the face, and he knew what that face had done. He knew Marcus had hurt people, multiple people, people who'd reported it and people who hadn't. Chuck had files. He had names. He had a particular kind of clarity about which people in Dallas were predators and which people were just struggling. Marcus was a predator. Chuck watched him. He watched the way Marcus checked his phone, the way he adjusted his position in the driver's seat, the way he looked at his watch, the way his body language shifted from anticipation to focused preparation. That shift took exactly 90 seconds. Then Marcus reached down and handed something to David. Even from 3 cars back, Chuck could see the knife's handle catch the streetlight. Chuck picked up the radio on his dashboard. Dallas PD dispatch. He gave them the location, the description of the van, and he told them to be discreet about it. No lights, no sirens, just a unit rolling past the intersection of 5th and Gentry in the next 15 minutes. Then Chuck waited. The reason he waited, instead of confronting them immediately, was simple. He didn't want them to run. He wanted them caught. He wanted the system to catch them. He wanted evidence, arrest, prosecution. He didn't want a street confrontation where they could claim anything. He wanted this solved with conviction, not with chalk outlines. But he was going to be there either way. Rachel Chen locked the ER's rear door at 2:04. She'd changed out of her scrubs into regular clothes, jeans and a cardigan and sneakers that had survived 17 hours of concrete floors and blood spatter she couldn't quite get off the heel. She had a 20-minute walk ahead of her. She was tired enough that she almost called a cab. But cabs cost money and she had rent due in 8 days, and her mom's medications weren't getting cheaper. She walked. She was thinking about a patient, the 7-year-old, the one who'd come in with internal bleeding that shouldn't have survived, but had. She was thinking about how his mother hadn't come to the hospital. She was thinking about how he'd be discharged to that situation and nobody could really stop it because the system wasn't designed to stop it. She was thinking so hard about this that she almost didn't notice the way the night changed. The streetlights stopped. Suddenly, right around 5th and Gentry, the world went dark. Rachel noticed. She stopped walking. Her keys were already in her hand. She was standing underneath a tree, in the kind of darkness where the only light was moonlight and distant streetlights 3 blocks away. And she was starting to calculate whether to run forward or backward. That was when she saw the van. It was parked at an angle that would let it pull directly in front of her if she ran forward. It was parked in a way that would block her escape. Rachel knew what this was. Marcus was out of the van before Rachel had finished processing the sight of it. He was moving with the kind of speed that comes from rehearsal. He'd done this in his head 50 times. He knew exactly how far he was from her. He knew exactly how fast he could move. He knew that she had maybe 3 seconds of lag time between seeing him and being physically unable to run away. He moved in the middle of that 3 seconds. David was out behind him, the knife already open, already visible. David was smiling. That was his problem. David liked the fear. David enjoyed watching people's faces when they realized they'd trapped themselves. Marcus didn't smile. Marcus was focused. Rachel was backing up. She was looking for an escape. There was a house behind her, dark. Probably no one home at this hour, but the fence was 6 feet tall. There was a street to her left, but it was exposed and open, and as she ran into it, they'd catch her in about 30 yards. Marcus was maybe 12 feet away now. Rachel's hand went to her mouth. She was getting ready to scream. That was her only real option. What happened in the next 6 seconds would be repeated in Dallas martial arts circles for more than 30 years. The car appeared between them like it had materialized from the darkness itself. That was what everyone who saw it would remember later. Not the sudden appearance of the car, but the absolute certainty that there was no way it could have been driving through that intersection at that precise moment with that precise speed without being there the entire time. And somehow, they hadn't seen it. Chuck Norris pulled his car directly between Rachel and the two men. He opened the door and stepped out. What Marcus and David saw was a man who was about 6 feet tall, who was carrying himself with the kind of calm that doesn't come from confidence. It comes from knowing exactly what your body can do. He was wearing a button-up shirt and jeans. He had his hands open at his sides. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have backup. He just had himself and what appeared to be absolute certainty about what was about to happen. Marcus's first instinct was to run. His second instinct was to kill whoever this was. He was processing which one to follow when Chuck spoke. Let her go. 3 words. That was all. David moved first. The knife came up, and David closed the distance between himself and Chuck with 3 quick steps. And he threw the blade in a diagonal upward cut, aimed directly at Chuck's throat. It was the move that had worked on 2 other men. It was the move he'd practiced 1,000 times. It was the move he had confidence in. Chuck stepped backward and to the left. Not a retreat, just a repositioning. The knife passed exactly 4 inches from his throat. Chuck could see the blade's edge. He could count the serrations. He could see David's shoulder turn as David committed to the cut. And he could see the moment David realized the blade had missed. He didn't have backup. He just had himself and what appeared to be absolute certainty about what was about to happen. Marcus's first instinct was to run. His second instinct was to kill whoever this was. He was processing which one to follow when Chuck spoke. Let her go. 3 words. That was all. David moved first. The knife came up, and David closed the distance between himself and Chuck with 3 quick steps. And he threw the blade in a diagonal upward cut, aimed directly at Chuck's throat. It was the move that had worked on 2 other men. It was the move he'd practiced 1,000 times. It was the move he had confidence in. Chuck stepped backward and to the left. Not a retreat, just a repositioning. The knife passed exactly 4 inches from his throat. Chuck could see the blade's edge. He could count the serrations. He could see David's shoulder turn as David committed to the cut. And he could see the moment David realized the blade had missed. And that moment was the trap. Chuck moved forward and he grabbed David's wrist with his right hand. Not hard, not with grip strength, with leverage. His thumb went to the pressure point on the inside of David's wrist, right where the radial artery was close to the surface. And he applied pressure in a specific direction that wasn't about pain. It was about neurological shutoff. The knife fell. David fell with it. Marcus ran. He didn't run toward his van. He ran backward toward the residential street, hoping to disappear into one of those dark houses and lose himself in the neighborhood. He was fast. He was moving at full speed, and he was maybe 20 feet away before Chuck decided to move. Chuck had released David. David was on the ground, conscious, but unable to move his right hand properly. The radial nerve had been temporarily compressed, and his fingers were useless. David wasn't a threat anymore, but Marcus had a destination. Chuck was fast too. People would later debate whether he actually closed the 40-foot distance, because by the time Marcus looked back over his shoulder, expecting to see at least another 30 feet of lead, Chuck was 3 feet behind him. The physics of it didn't make sense. A normal person running at full speed couldn't cover that distance in the time it took Marcus to check his distance. It was impossible, but it happened. Marcus tried to cut left into a driveway. Chuck was there. Marcus tried to accelerate. Chuck was beside him. Marcus tried to drive his elbow backward into Chuck's face. Chuck redirected the elbow downward and to the left, using Marcus's own momentum, and Marcus found himself on the ground before he understood how he'd gotten there. Chuck wasn't on top of him. Chuck wasn't punching him. Chuck had just adjusted Marcus's trajectory, adjusted his momentum, let gravity do the work. "Stay down," Chuck said. He said it quietly. He said it like a statement of fact, not a warning. like he was informing Marcus of something Marcus already knew. Marcus stayed down. The Dallas PD unit arrived 4 minutes later. They found Marcus and David and Rachel and Chuck in exactly that formation. Rachel was against Chuck's car, shaking but unhurt. Marcus was on the concrete, breathing hard, fully expecting to be beaten to death, confused that he wasn't. David was lying on his side with his right hand useless and his body in shock. The knife was 10 feet away on the concrete. What the police reported was what Rachel had told them. 2 men had followed her from the hospital with the intention to rob her, possibly worse, and a man in the parking lot had intervened. The man had stopped them. He had hurt neither of them badly. The police had arrived before anything serious could happen. What the police didn't know, what Chuck never told them, was that Marcus Webb had actually believed for approximately 3 minutes that he was going to die. Not because Chuck had threatened him, but because Chuck's silence had suggested it. Because Chuck's calmness had suggested it. Because the complete absence of fear in Chuck's face had suggested that dying was a possibility he'd already accepted. Marcus had never experienced that before. He would spend the next 6 months in county jail waiting for trial, and he would think about it almost every day. The 3 officers who took Marcus and David into custody knew who Chuck was. Dallas PD knew Chuck. They'd worked with him on multiple cases. They knew his name and his background, and they knew that if Chuck had been there, the situation would be handled correctly. Officer Mitchell took the statement from Rachel. Officer Torres took the statement from Chuck. Officer Dawson called for the evidence tech to photograph and bag the knife. "You didn't have to do this," Torres said to Chuck. "You could have called it in and stayed out of it." "I did call it in," Chuck said. "They were already in position when I called." "They would have hurt her," Torres said. "Maybe worse." "I know," Chuck said. "How did you know to be here?" Chuck didn't answer that. He just looked back at Rachel, who was still shaking, but who was already starting to think about returning to her apartment instead of hiding, already starting to process that she was alive and that she would make it to her next shift because of what had happened in this intersection. "You should probably get her home," Chuck said. Torres nodded and went to arrange a ride for Rachel. An officer would drive her. They'd make sure she made it to her door. It wasn't policy, but it was the right thing to do, and nobody was going to file a complaint about it. Chuck waited until Rachel's car had left the intersection before he got back in his car. He didn't look back at Marcus or David. He didn't acknowledge the officers' thanks or their understanding. He just started his car and drove away from 5th and Gentry like nothing had happened. It took him approximately 6 minutes to get back to his hotel. The story got out because Rachel told it. She told her colleagues at Parkland. She told her family. She told the security guard who checked her ID badge every morning. She told her neighbor. And from there, it moved the way stories move. Slowly at first, then exponentially, then into the permanent folklore of Dallas's karate and martial arts community. By the end of the month, everyone in every dojo in Dallas knew that Chuck Norris had stopped a robbery, that he'd stopped 2 violent men, that he'd done it without leaving a mark that needed medical attention, that he'd been calm, that he'd been exact, that he'd been there because his instincts had put him in the right place at the right time. By the end of the year, the story had changed slightly. Now Chuck had been following them since they'd left the hospital. Now he'd been protecting Rachel without her even knowing it. Now he'd anticipated their move with the knife and had guided David's arm into an arch that would miss him by inches. By the time 5 years had passed, the story had settled into something that was true in its essential shape, but embellished in its details. The way legend stories do. The way the best stories always do. What stayed consistent was this. Chuck Norris was the kind of person who moved through the world with an awareness that most people didn't have. He saw predators. He understood violence. He intervened not because he was looking for confrontation, but because confrontation was less interesting to him than stopping it before it could happen. The story was still being told in dojos and training facilities all across Dallas 30 years later. Marcus Webb got 12 years for the attempted robbery and assault. The charges would have been lighter, but Rachel identified him. The knife brought the charges up. The history of priors pushed it higher. By the time the trial finished, Marcus was 63 months into a sentence that would keep him until 1998. When he got out, he was 34 years old, and something had fundamentally changed in him. He would never again move through the world with the sense of invulnerability that had defined his 20s. He would never again believe that his predatory nature was his edge. He'd learned, in exactly 6 seconds of physical contact with Chuck Norris, that there were people in the world who operated on a completely different level. He got a job at a warehouse in 1998. He stayed there for 19 years. He was quiet, he was stable, he never committed another violent crime. People who knew Marcus after he got out would say he was a different person. He never explained why. David Kemp's right hand never fully recovered. The nerve damage was too extensive. He could move his fingers, but the fine motor control never came back. He couldn't open a knife one-handed anymore. He couldn't perform the move that had defined him. By the time he got out of jail in 1991, he'd already accepted that the version of himself that had been dangerous was gone. He took that as a kind of mercy. Rachel Chen kept working at Parkland Hospital for another 11 years. She finished her nursing degree, she became a shift supervisor, she eventually moved to a hospital in a safer neighborhood. But she never forgot the intersection of 5th and Gentry in November 1986. She never forgot the moment the car appeared between her and 2 men who wanted to harm her. She never forgot the absolute calmness of the man who stepped out. Years later, when she was telling this story to her daughter asked, "Do you think he saved your life?" Rachel thought about this for a long time. "I think he did something better," she said. "He changed the trajectory of it. He changed what happened that night from something destructive into something protective." And everybody else in that story, the man who tried to kill me, the man who wanted to rob me, all of them, they were changed by the interaction too. Not because he hurt them, but because he showed them something they couldn't unsee. "What did he show them?" her daughter asked. "That there are consequences for certain kinds of choices," Rachel said. "But also that those consequences don't have to be permanent. That people can change. That the kind of person you were doesn't have to be the kind of person you'll always be." Chuck never spoke about it publicly. He was asked, years later in an interview, about the incident at 5th and Gentry. The interviewer brought it up directly. They had their facts mostly correct. They knew the date, the location, the general shape of what had happened. Chuck listened to the summary, and then he said something that would be remembered by everyone who was in that room. "The fight isn't the important part," he said. "Stopping the fight before it has to happen. That's the point. I wasn't there because I wanted to confront anyone. I was there because I understood what was about to happen. And understanding something before it happens gives you options that you don't have once it's already begun." The interviewer pressed him for more details about the physical encounter. What had he done to David exactly? How had he moved so fast with Marcus? Chuck didn't elaborate. "Technique is a useful thing to discuss in a training context," he said. "But when we're talking about a real situation with real consequences, technique is just the mechanism." A nurse walked home from a hospital shift at 2 a.m. 2 predators were waiting in an intersection where the streetlights didn't work. A man who understood violence drove between them and stepped out into the dark. And everything changed.